Okay, the Spanish. To a lesser extent, the Portuguese, but largely we're going to look at it specifically with Spanish. I have no idea why it gets called Latin America. I mean, Spanish comes, it's one of the Latin-based languages, but so is French and etc. So who knows anything else. It's important to remember, not only is Columbus working for the Spanish, he was Italian, but he was working for the Spanish when he discovers, quote, the New World. But most importantly, the Spanish immediately jump on this. And we've seen this before. If we go back to the India stuff, the Spanish were competing with the Portuguese, which nowadays seems pretty weird. We're competing with the Portuguese for basically global domination. And so they were the equivalent of sort of like China and the US or Russia or something like that in the 1500s. And the goal was China. The resources, the wealth, much of it entirely imaginary. But anyways, what everyone wanted from Europe, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese, was access to China, and they wanted a monopoly of it. And so the Portuguese are first to bat. So the Portuguese, as we saw earlier, get there by virtue of going around Africa, and in doing so, set up colonies along the African coast, and they get to India, at Goa, and they start making a ton of money there and developing trade, and then move on to China. So basically, so they go this way around India and end up, basically over here. Now, the Spanish then can't do that. The Portuguese at the time were militarily, at least naval-wise, the equivalent, if not better than the Spanish. So if the Spanish picked a fight with the Portuguese, the Spanish are going to get the crap beat out of them. So the Spanish decided, well, what we're going to do is if you can't, basically leave here and you can turn left to go there, what we're going to do is we're going to turn right. And that's why they sponsored Columbus and a bunch of other folks to basically explore this region. So their logic is we're going to go this way to get to China rather than going that way because the Portuguese will beat us. In doing so, of course, they run into the Americas, which I'm sure you remember from grade school or something like that. But it's sort of hard for us, I think, now to remember sometimes the size of the Spanish Empire, since the Spanish are not only first to bat, but they were incredibly aggressive and just almost pathologically avaricious. Is they end up dominating the Americas in an incredibly short period of time. In the space of less than 20 years, they take over one of the world's largest military empires in what's now in Mexico, Guatemala, et cetera, in terms of the Aztecs. At the same time, in roughly that same 20-year period, they're also taking over the Inca Empire, which ran from basically Colombia all the way down to Chile, which again was this huge, enormously powerful military. And both these empires were military based. They were both based on military control of local populations. So they were both largely, if you would, invaders themselves. So the Spanish come in and whack both of them with incredibly small numbers of conquistadores of their military. Ended up immediately, in a very incredibly short period of time, taking over this enormous part of the Americas. Now, one reason, and in a weird way, it was probably simpler, was the fact that you already had these large existing political empires. So what you do is you wipe out the political elite of the Aztecas, and you basically take over their empire. So you don't have to build it on your own. It's like knocking someone out of their house, then you move into their house. You don't have to build a house. You just beat the crap out of people who already own it. Same thing in South America. So with getting rid of the Aztec emperor, Atahualpa, they basically then find themselves in control of what would now be 6 countries in South America. Literally bang, just like that. But you have to remember, they also ended up swallowing up almost everything else. They really intentionally initially took all of the Caribbean. Other countries didn't take it from them, like the British, the French, etc. They take over all of southern North America, Florida. They take over everything from Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, what's now California. All this becomes part of Alta Mexico. And so, it was oftentimes called Alta California. And so they controlled basically what would now be a good maybe third of the United States. And everything from basically, if you want to figure, Northern California and New Mexico, all the way down to the tip of Tierra del Fuego. So in the space of less than, maybe 100 years, they were controlling a continent and a half with incredibly small numbers of people. Probably no more than 10, 15, 20,000 at most. A mind-blowing achievement. And especially because the Spanish were just stunningly brutal. Like I mentioned before, they were just pathologically avaricious. They were absolutely totally fixated on wealth. And that meant not only as a government, but also individually. Conquistadores were notorious for the fact that they didn't give a rat's ass about anything except how much they could get out of it. So torturing people to, to find out where they hid their gold, just to find out they didn't have any gold, well, they just keep on torturing them anyways, was very typical behavior. Their entire reason for conquering America was very simply the amount of money they could get out of it. So they were not only avaricious, they were avaricious, very specific to silver and gold. They were really disinterested in other resources. So they, it's basically like a bunch of guys burgling a house. They just want, a couple of things. And if they get those, they're happy. No, they're going to, pretty much enslave the locals. But if they don't get those, they're going to be really pissed off and look for them somewhere else. If you really want to see this in classic form, the ones I'm most familiar with would be southern part of the United States. Go Google Cibola, Cibola, or El Dorado. In terms of what the locals did in terms of spinning stories to get the Spanish to leave, just by telling them, hey, I don't have any money, but this guy that lives across the mountain, he's got streets that are paved in gold. And the Spanish would just go tearing off after these guys. They're just mental. It's really, really, really strange. One of the other aspects of Spanish, you have to remember the Spanish not only taking over here, but for example, if you're from Guam, they take over Guam. And if you're from, if you're a Tagalog, for example, they take over that section of the Philippines, the area around Manila. And so this all becomes part of the Spanish Empire. It was absolutely huge when you think about it. It was very fragile in some ways. But the sort of surreal aspect of the Spanish Empire is when they set up their empire, they've got a very fixed set of molds. And so no matter where they are in the world, the local population has to fit into that mold. And so basically, if they don't, they just hit them with a larger hammer and a larger hammer until they fit. And if you end up getting rid of all the locals, well, so be it, which is what they sort of end up doing with the Chimotos and wiped out the vast majority of Chimoto society in a very short period of time. Not because they particularly care, but because their attitude is if you're the Spanish Empire, you should look like this, you should act like this, you should talk like this, and this is what you should believe. And you have two choices. You can either do it, or we're going to enslave you and or kill you. It says something that the Spanish Empire had the Inquisition, which is a Spanish, I don't know if we call it invention, but Spanish really liked it. They keep that going, for example, in the Philippines and Guam right into the, I think, early 1700s, which is way after they got rid of it in the rest of Europe and other places. So the Spanish Empire was tied by two things. One is everyone had to do it the Spanish way. And the second was tied to the Catholic Church. Because you have to remember at the time, in most of this period, the Spanish king was also the Holy Roman Emperor. So he saw himself as the protector of the faith, if you want to think of an equivalent to Islam. So the Spanish king saw himself as the protector and exporter and champion, if you would, of Catholicism. So the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown were the same thing for this period. And this is why when you go to areas that were in the Spanish Empire, you'll almost invariably find a plaza, a central open area, and wherever the capital city is. At one end will be the gobernadores, or the governor's palace, which is where the guy that ran the place for the Spanish was at. Directly, usually opposite of it, will be a huge cathedral where the Catholic Church was. And so the Catholic Church was intimately involved in the Catholic Empire. The Catholic Church spent a lot of time in the last 100-something years trying to sort of separate itself from that history, but I don't know that it's ever going to work particularly well. So it was a package deal. Catholicism and the Spanish Empire were a package deal. In later history, that sort of changes as the Spanish lose control of the church, et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, but the key here is what that means is if you're under Spanish control, whether it be Argentina in the south, whether it be Colombia in the middle, whether it be southern, would now be Alta California in the southern part of California, or New Mexico, Texas, wherever, things were always the same. The Spanish weren't interested in your culture. The Spanish weren't interested in who you were. They saw human beings in these areas that they conquered as being draft animals. In fact, that's actually how the Spanish crown thought of them. And so what they would do is if I end up being one of these conquistadores and I take a bunch of property in Arizona, all the Indians that lived in my property in Arizona were seen as draft animals. They were counted just like you'd count horses or, cows or anything like that. They were just part of the landscape. They weren't human beings. And that's why it really wasn't to the Spanish, slavery wasn't slavery. Because to the Spanish, they weren't enslaving people, they were basically domesticating wild animals. And that's a view that they kept right into the 1700s. In fact, I can say in some ways, you'd probably say they kept it right into the late 1800s. And so what this means is the Spanish Empire looks the same. There's very little difference between Puerto Rico, Mexico, Guam, and Manila. in terms of how they look, in terms of the Spanish influence. And what you find, among other things, for example, if you're familiar with Tagalog dress for formal events, that's exactly the same type of dress that you'd find in Mexico or in Peru or someplace like that, because that's Spanish formal dress from about 200 or 300 years ago, because that's the only thing the Spanish would allow for that stuff. So the Spanish basically put this huge, heavy iron fist on everything, just sort of smacked. And so any place that was under the Spanish Empire looked like every other place under the Spanish Empire. Now, there was no interest in diversity. There was no interest in variety. And it was all based on basically explicitly mercenary practices for the purpose of extracting the vast amount of money you could for as little investment or effort as you could put into it. Now, what this does is this then flips us over. Oops, I'm not sure this worked here. Hang on a second. Okay. What this means then is the Spanish system was always the same. And this is why the Spanish, for example, the Spanish parts of the Caribbean look really pretty radically different from the Dutch or the French or the American or whatever. So there were two parts to this. One is that all land in the Spanish Empire belonged to the King of Spain. So in that regard, it's very much similar to what you'd have here in Hawaii, traditionally with a Hawaiian high chief. It's what we call usufruct rights. So what you did is you were given a grant of land by the King of Spain. So for example, if someone, petitions the king and says, I'd like to start up a big ranch in Arizona, what's now Arizona. And so the king says, okay, the king will give you, 100,000 acres. Here, take this. Well, obviously what you do is you have to pay taxes or something to the king. So he's going to get his share out of it. But so what these large land grants were given out by the king. Now, what that means, if all of a sudden a week from now, someone whispers in the king's ear that, you shouldn't have given Borden that land grant, then the king can just tear it up. You have no legal recourse. The king was considered nearest to God. So there was no legal system that ruled the king. The king ruled the system. And so anyone who had large amounts of property had them on the sufferance of the King of Spain, which could be revoked at any time. Or all of a sudden you could give the land to someone else. It's Monday, hey, I'll give the land to so-and-so. And so there was never any stability. Now, what that meant is two things. For the vast majority of the population, obviously they weren't going to get anything from the King of Spain because they knew they existed. So they had no land. So the huge majority of the population in the Spanish system were basically landless. They're what we call peasants. There's a very, very, very small minority that's going to be the folks with land. Now, the folks with land are invariably going to be Spanish. So immediately here, what you have is segregation, but it's not quite the same segregation as you see what we now think of in terms of racial segregation in North America. Because you have to remember in the Spanish system, if you go to Spain in this period, Spain was not a white country. It was not howling in the classic sense of, people who had light skin. The folks in the northern part did, but the folks in the southern part of Spain tend to be pretty dark. In fact, a lot of them are very, very dark because they're actually the descendants of the Berbers that came up from North Africa that controlled that place when it was Andalusia. So they're, the color that people have in their skin in Spain varies tremendously from family to family. Some of your most powerful families are really dark. Darker by far the most African Americans you'd see here, because Berbers are actually the darkest, I believe, one of the 2 or 3 darkest, melanin skinned populations on the planet. So you find some Spanish who are incredibly dark skinned. Other Spanish tend to be very light skinned. But the key here in the Spanish system was and still is, what's your last name? What's your relationship to the people in authority? So if it would, your social network defined your social status, not the color of your skin. This makes it very different than the British and the French who are already going off on the skin color thing. So in the Spanish system, it was your relationship with Spain, your relationship with the King of Spain and the royal court that defined who you were. So all the people that own large chunks of property were going to be Spanish. They weren't going to necessarily be white in the way that Americans think of it, but they would all be very clearly Spanish. They would have Spanish last names, and they would be old Spanish last names, and they'd be powerful Spanish last names. So that becomes your class system. And that's still what you see in Latin America and in the Caribbean, most of the Spanish areas of the Caribbean. These are the populations that were called Hispanic, and that means specifically people from Spain. And that was the system they had. I remember my grandpa used to run a ranch in Southern California. It was now Santa Barbara. And the family that owned the ranch, and I believe they still own it, were actually one of the families that were given the ranch by the King of Spain. They still had the original deed of property back in 1710 or something like that, where the King of Spain gave them that ranch. And they'd managed to keep it, which was sort of a trick. But nonetheless, the key there was they were very clear they were Spanish. Yeah, they had been in North America for a couple of hundred years by then, but the kids went to school in Spain. They still saw themselves as Spanish folks living in North America. They did not see themselves as American. They sure as hell didn't see themselves as Mexican. They were Spanish speakers, but they spoke beautiful, beautiful Castilian, or what I'd call Barcelona Spanish. They did not speak what they saw as a real low-class Mexican accent. So you had the weird situation growing up in a largely Mexican neighborhood where you're hearing one form of Spanish being talked by that population. You go to the ranch and you hear an entirely different form of Spanish from a very sophisticated, very educated elite who see Americans as being very much sort of like a bunch of, nouveau riche type, posers, legitimately probably. And that becomes the Spanish system. So this is anywhere you see the Spanish Empire, you'd find this group on top that owns everything. A group in the middle that were called mestizos, which were, folks that were basically Japa as a result of the elites casually and illegally intermarried with, folks in the bottom. So they're never accepted into the families, but they become an ever larger part of the population, have some access to stuff. That's your mestizos or mixed group. At the bottom, throughout most of the Spanish system, what you find are indios. And that's your indigenous populations where the Spanish conquered, took over and treated as, basically slaves, draft animals. That's the Spanish social class system. And it still exists in most of the Spanish, former Spanish Empire. That's still how people divvy themselves up. Very, very different than the British and French Dutch system that you see that gets brought into largely North America, which is based on skin tint. Hang on a sec here. Sorry about that. Okay, so in the Spanish system, what you then have is several things. One is very few people own stunningly huge parts of property. You still see this in Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Nicaragua, interesting enough, a lot of that property is now owned by the Dole family, has a Dole here. So it doesn't have to be local. Well, it doesn't have to be Spanish, but what you can guarantee is not going to be locals. The vast majority of the local population still has almost none, if any, land at all. And this is what you see. It's still, a huge political issue, for example, in the Philippines. Even though the Spanish disappeared there in, 1898, that system is still very few families own enormous amounts of property. The vast majority of the population will squat. Same thing in Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the huge problems you find in Latin America today, as a result of the Spanish control, is most folks in Latin America don't own anything. And so land policies, land control, land ownership not only defines who your elites are, but it's also probably the most important political issue you find anywhere where the Spanish were in charge, because it's never been resolved. The elites aren't dumb enough to give up their authority and give up their land. Why would you give up power? The second is what you then end up is because of the Spanish controls based in Spain, is you end up what I would call sort of the absentee landlord, which is oftentimes, the best way to describe it is called the hacienda system, which basically means that the folks that have all this property are going to have the estancia, the large estate, are going to have some very nice central, village or whatever where they run their operations. It's called the hacienda. It's a large mansion, usually a ranch or whatever. But what you're going to find is they're also going to have apartments in wherever the capital city is. So if they live in Oaxaca, for example, Mexico, they'll have apartments in Mexico City. Why? Because under Spanish rule, the guy that ran that part of the Americas was the gubernatorial governor of Mexico. So the gubernatorial de Mexico was actually the guy that ran the system for the King of Spain. So you needed to PR him because otherwise someone could get the king's ear and your land grant would disappear. What you're also then going to do is if you got this wealth and resources, you send your kids back to Spain to be educated. Because two reasons: one, them to be Spanish. You don't want them to be from the Americas per se. And secondly, is you want very, very much that they end up getting involved in political court life in Spain to make sure they can not only protect the family holdings, as since the King of Spain can take them anytime, but if they're really good at it, they can actually increase the family holdings, not by virtue of buying property in the Americas or doing a deal with someone else, but literally getting the king to just write him another piece of paper and give him another piece of property. So the hacienda system, where basically on one hand you live in Mexico or you live in Guatemala or you live in Peru, but at the same time your actual interests are largely still Spanish. And in many cases you still see yourself as Spanish living in the Americas. So you see yourself as a descendant of the conquistadores, basically. Is very, very much a mindset that you find. And this is one thing that I think Americans have a really hard time grasping, is in much of Latin America, they're absolutely fascinated with what goes on in Europe. And they see themselves in many cases more closely tied to Europe than they do with the countries around them. Argentina is probably the most famous case of this, where a lot of Argentine politics has to do with their relationship with European countries, not with Brazil or Chile or the other countries around them. And in many ways, they still see themselves as they still identify themselves with their European heritage, which isn't true, of course, like 90-something% of the population, but it is controlled. It is true of the elites who still run the systems. And so the other part of this is, ironically, a very explicit part of this mindset. I grew up in this system, is that people on horseback invariably were people that had status, prestige, and wealth. So having a horse and riding a horse or riding around on a horse meant that you were elite. It meant that you were Spanish. It meant that you were part of this Hispanic control group. And so having horses in Latin America was and still is an incredibly important thing. If you bump into someone and they're riding a horse, and they just sort of casually mention, my horse is in the stable, right off the bat that there's somebody. It's not, that's actually as important in some ways, or not going to be more important than, the size of the house or where the house is located or something. Having a horse and being on horseback is still hugely important in the Latin American system. And this becomes the idea of the caballado. And this is why, among other things, rodeos are so hugely popular in Latin America. Anything to do with horseback, anything to do with riding skills is an incredibly popular social pastime. There's the things when you get into the American side of the equation, with the exception areas that used to be in the Spanish Empire, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and some Texas, you tend to find that the horse sort of, doesn't ever have that. The horse just becomes a early form of car or a motorcycle. But in the Spanish Empire, they weren't, and then in the ex-Spanish Empire, they still aren't. Horses are a really, really big thing. And the image of the person on horseback, you'll almost invariably find, for example, during Mexican national elections, which are the ones I'm most familiar with, you'll actually find that almost invariably all the candidates will make sure they do some photo op where they're actually riding around on horseback. And that's sort of implying to everyone that they're part of the elite, and therefore they should know how to do stuff because their family's been in charge for X. Very, very sort of interesting, very different system. And it's one reason why Latin America really has very little in common in a lot of ways with North America, where the relationship with Europe is radically different. The relationship in terms of groups to each other is based on entirely different parameters. So, when people think of Mexico being different than the United States, it is, but probably not for the reasons they tend to sort of use as stereotypes.